Our first speaker will be Roger Agnès. He's a writer and an anti-war activist in Vancouver. He has written extensively on events in Egypt during the last year. He has published in Truthout, Rebel.ca, and he has a website, A Socialist in Canada.
Hi everyone, sorry to be a little late. I've just come from another session where I was speaking on a topic not unlike the one we're talking about here, which is the war in Ukraine, to extremely important international issues for us to be getting informed about and getting active on, because our government in both cases is very present in the political situation in Egypt, and not for good reasons. I began to write about the coup in Egypt, which I called it a coup from the get-go, partly because I have come from a 10-year experience of solidarity with the people of Haiti, which is a neighbor country of ours in the Caribbean, and the largest country by population, second largest country by population in the Caribbean. And the people of Haiti suffered a coup in the year 2004. And I saw an awful lot of similarities of what was taking place in Egypt. That is a false presentation of the situation that the Egyptian people were confronting, and a very destructive solution to whatever were the issues that people observing internationally would come to see. And so in the case of Haiti now, there's been 10 years of government under direct foreign military occupation sponsored by the UN Security Council, called MINUSTA. What I was seeing in Egypt was the vast and large protest movement that was taking place in the streets of the country in May and June. Seemed pretty reasonable to me that people in Egypt would have complaints about their government. Every people in the world have complaints to make about their government. The degree of complaint and the degree of problems with the government vary from country to country, but nobody lives in a perfect world. And in a country like Egypt, which had inherited decades of U.S.-dominated neo-colonial government, it was no surprise that there were very substantial ongoing social, economic, and political concerns that the country needed to have addressed. And also that Egypt, although by far the largest country in the Middle East, is not playing the leadership role that it should in the Middle East, precisely because of the successive regimes that were beholden to U.S. and European foreign policy. And of course, the dictator Hosni Mubarak for several decades led that government. So it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that, instantaneously Egypt was going to arrive at perfect government and no one would have any complaints. And so that's how I viewed events. Sure, people have concerns about economic policy, they want social development, they have different ideas of how the government should govern. But when I saw the coup take place, something entirely different opened up before my eyes. I honestly confess that I wasn't following Egypt closely, just closely enough to know that when an elected government, and a legitimate elected government, is overthrown in a military coup, I don't care what the reasons are that might be argued to justify that, this is a bad thing. It's a bad thing for the people of the country, and it's a bad thing for the people of the world. And the more I investigated the story, I found that the justification had no foundation. President Morsi was presented as being kind of a successor to Hosni Mubarak, and I was greatly concerned about the gross exaggeration that was being perpetrated. And so I began to write about that aspect of the story, and also how so much of the political and liberal left in the world fell for the story, the false story that President Morsi was kind of another dictator like Hosni Mubarak, and therefore there was some legitimacy to the coup. It was a terrible misrepresentation that was taking place of events in Egypt through that line of thinking, and my colleagues on the left were buying into it. I'm thinking, what's going on here? And so we find in Egypt, as we found in Haiti, some very flawed thinking that's happening in the international left and also in the international development movement. Because I don't know so much about the case of Egypt, but in Haiti, the non-governmental organizations that sort of profited from this system of domination over Haiti, where so much of the country's social services and other economic development is operated by charities from abroad, stripping the national government of its resources and its political sovereignty. You know, this is what Haiti exposed to us, and now we see kind of another variant of this in Egypt. That is, if people have a complaint about a government, that somehow a coup by a military regime and the return of a dictator could somehow resolve this. So these are, you know, very serious questions, not only for the people of Egypt and what they're suffering under, but they're very serious concerns for us, because we have, in any time that this government is engaged, as it is in Egypt, and engaged on the wrong side, then we have a responsibility. If we don't speak up about that, if we don't act about that, we become complicit. And so we're obligated to learn about these events in Egypt and to do something about them. That is to protest our government's complicity in the coup. That's what I'll call it. The Canadian government has openly supported the overthrow of an elected president and parliament in Egypt. They played around with words in the beginning month or two, and then it became very explicit. And Stephen Harper said, better to have Sisi in power than what he called instability, which is the phrase when they have a government in power, as in the case of President Morsi, that they don't control and they can't, you know, dictate policy to. And so we have a responsibility there. And we lived through several months of denial even over the events. In July, August, September, all kinds of, no, it wasn't a coup. The people in Egypt were concerned. They had a mass democratic movement in the streets. They got rid of a dictatorial government. And it's taken, sadly, it's taken the events themselves, as we saw in the film, to disprove that thesis. No one can deny today that in Egypt we have a ruthless dictatorial regime in power, worse than the decades that the Egyptian people suffered under Hosni Mubarak. No one can deny that unless they're just either living in a dream world or they're simply dishonest. So, you know, now we have the fact. Unfortunately, it took months of confusion over events before we could arrive at that. But now we have the facts, and so now there's no excuse not to be involved, not to be engaged. These were the mass protests in June that took place. I mean, there it is. There's lots of people in the streets and lots of people with complaints about their government. But how does social and political complaint against the government become transformed and a complaint against an elected government, a legitimate elected government? So how does this become transformed into a military coup with the likes of this? Well, something profound has happened there. And indeed, when we look at the circumstances that were unfolding in April and May and June as these mass protests went into the streets, we find that there was an intervention, a political intervention into the mass protest movement on the part of what's called the deep state of Egypt. That is the economic and military elite who never wanted to have any change, never wanted to lose Hosni Mubarak as the ruler of the country, or if they lost Mubarak, then someone like him would take their place. They were intervening actively in the mass civil movement in April, May, and June. I don't call it a movement manipulated, but I say they were intervening and they were affecting the course of its development. This has all become, more and more documented as the months have taken place since the coup 13 months ago. So there's some pretty powerful lessons there, because we've seen in recent months, we've seen mass protest movements in Brazil. We saw them in Ukraine at the end of last year and the beginning of this year. We're going to see more of them because we live in an unequal world. We live in a world that's, headed towards a deep climate crisis, where we're seeing the rise of war and militarism. There's many reasons why people need to be complaining in the world today about the state of affairs. And so we need to be on guard, because we don't want social protest movements to be transformed into their opposite. And so that's the lesson that we need to draw from these events. Now, I very much appreciated the film, because I was going to address a list of the civil rights outrages that have taken place in Egypt. They're very grave, very serious, the last 13 months. And just some days ago now, we marked the 1-year anniversary of the very worst of the civil rights violations that took place in Egypt, which was the suppression of the largest of the mass protests involving tens of thousands of people in the streets of Cairo, who for weeks and weeks and weeks on end at Al Araba Square protested in the streets. And on August 14th, that was put down with force and violence. Now, this is very important. Human Rights Watch has published a report just some days ago now, looking back 1 year ago at Al Rabaa. This is an extremely important document because it details, they say, they can count 817 people who died in the massacre at Al Rabaa, but they say it's well over 1,000. That's just what they could count. But this document details what took place that day. It details the other events that were described here that weren't as grave as this one, but have taken place. And this is very important to put on the political record. And the report has proposals that are extremely important now for us to act on, which is, I've summarized them here. They're more detailed in the report. But the United Nations, the Human Rights Agency of the United Nations have a duty and a responsibility to conduct a formal inquiry into the violations of political rights that have taken place in Egypt and to act on their findings through the international courts. The Canadian government has to cease its support to the military regime in power in Egypt today. And I would just throw in, I think that part of this, of those who have suffered through the events in Egypt are the people of Palestine. Because under President Morsi, conditions opened up for dialogue, and the border was eased, the border travel between Gaza and Egypt, and all that was closed off by the military regime. So the Palestinian people have suffered deeply through this coup as well. So we need to find a way to join our protests against this present military coup regime in Egypt, together with the movement of solidarity in Palestine, because both will become much stronger as a result of doing that. So I'll end here because time is up, and I'm very pleased to be here and be part of this very important discussion. I've been out on the actions in Vancouver, and will continue to do so, because this is together with the Palestine people, we have a new kind of Middle East that needs to be created, and we have to get back on the path of hope and of democracy that the election of President Morsi opened up in 2012. We need to retake that path and move forward from there.
Thank you very much, Roger Anis. Actually, the number of victims in Rabaa may never be known. Some bodies were burned beyond recognition. Some bodies were not removed, could not be removed from the morgue unless their parents or would sign that they died of natural causes. So that's the tragedy.